The Late Morning Program with Nam Ras Podcast.
Emergency podcast with Venkata.
Why is
They do that nowadays.
what's an emergency podcast?
It's like someone who does a podcast regularly, like at specific intervals when they have to do a specific topic or something emergency wise. They call it emergency podcast.
So it like breaks with the regular schedule.
Yeah, a break in the schedule.
We don't have like a set schedule though, do we?
Every 2 weeks, I put it.
You post it every 2
podcast
weeks,
out, yeah.
right? So is this gonna break the every 2 weeks? I guess we could decide.
Yeah, I'm gonna edit this and I'll put it out in a few days.
What's the emergency?
It's like you said. It's like the time. 1 second. This is not a good angle.
Yeah, let's change the angle.
Yeah, that's better.
This is better. Or do you want to sit? No, but then how would that?
This is fine. This works better. Okay. See that?
Yeah, I think that. So I'm looking at you. I'm still in the shot.
You're still in the shot. You're just looking at me. Okay.
And then how's this one? This one's okay?
That one's fine. Yeah, it's fine. Whatever. It's just a wide angle. So, yeah. What I was saying was that emergency in the sense the podcasts I've been doing recently, they're not going to come out for like 3-4 months.
Right.
While this one, to keep the strike while the iron's hot type thing.
Yeah. And for it to be topical, right? Because sometimes you talk
Topical.
about something
Yes.
and then like 2-3 months later.
Yes.
So like, I don't know if we can talk about this or if it'll mess up like the sequence. See, this is part of the thing when you record in advance and then you post it later, right? But like we had a guest on, and at the time we talked to that person. That person had not yet shared the news that they were an initiating guru.
Right.
And then like a week later, it's like big news. This person like is taking disciples.
Right.
And we're like, dude, we just talked to you like a week ago. You couldn't like
something.
You couldn't like have mentioned that maybe like we're like, hey, what's new? We're like, not much. I'm just,
I mean, it's big news. I
huge
understand
news.
if you'd want to keep it on the DL, right?
True. But now because that episode hasn't aired yet.
That's true. Oh, I see what you're
So
saying.
now when it airs, it's going to be like months later.
Right.
And everyone's going to be like, why didn't these two idiots ask him about being like a guru?
Yeah, right.
Because we're having this whole conversation about guruship and stuff.
Yes.
And we never like,
Yes.
yeah. So it's one of those,
Yeah.
Anyway, it's one of the, I guess the downsides of like recording first and then posting later.
Yeah.
But
So let's talk about why this emergency podcast came about.
yeah, what's the emergency?
So Joe Rogan had David Whitehouse is his name?
I don't know his name.
Okay. Joe Rogan had a podcast maybe 1 or 2 podcasts ago. He does like every other day or something.
We don't need to explain who Joe Rogan is. Like everyone knows who Joe Rogan is. Is that right?
The Prayojanacharya podcast thing. So he had this guy on, David Whitehouse, I believe his name is, who is the producer of Krishna's, I forgot the exact name of the documentary, the Krishna's documentary about New Vrindavan.
This is the documentary that everyone, at least everyone that I talk to, calls the Peacock documentary, right?
Peacock documentary,
Because
exactly.
it aired on
Yes.
Peacock, which is NBC's live streaming service.
Yes. So he was on the podcast, which is the most famous podcast in the whole world, and he spoke about Bhaktipad, Prabhupada, Krishna.
Did you hear the whole
Vrindavan
thing?
Monkeys. I watched maybe 3/4 of it.
How long is it?
It's 2.5 hours long.
Okay, because I just saw like I
Yeah.
think like a 10, 15 minute clip.
The main part is like the first half an hour.
Okay.
And it's really good. He speaks incredibly favorably towards devotees.
He meaning the filmmaker or Joe Rogan?
The filmmaker. No, Rogan's like, it's a cult and this and that. And the guy's like, no,
Well,
it's
Rogan's
not.
kind of provocative, right?
But he's not saying it like to be provocative.
He's just like, he's just thinking out loud.
Yeah, because he knows he's been seeing devotees in airports and things like that.
Yeah.
So he's like, yeah, the Hare Krishnas, I know what they are. His friend, Duncan Trussell, who's other famous person, he's into Hare Krishna. He's into Prabhupada and things like that.
Oh, yeah. I remember hearing about this. Okay, yeah.
And he's a good friend of Joe Rogan. So
right. And I think, is he the person that's like a mutual friend of Raghunath and Joe Rogan? There's like a whole other story there, right?
No, that's another person.
Okay. Anyway, but Joe's been around, and Joe, as if I talk about him as if he's like my buddy.
Yeah.
But Joe Rogan.
We have a connection with him. Raghunath was our.
I guess Raghunath is our. Yeah, we're all separated. We're all like 1 degree from Raghunath.
1 degree.
Man, thank God for Raghunath, man. Raghunath and Jay Shetty. But anyway, that's a whole other topic. So let's not even go there.
Right.
But Joe Rogan has been around, has maybe a mixed opinion, but this filmmaker you're saying is like basically saying this really like sort of what we would call like favorable stuff.
Yeah, very favorable.
And he's the guy that made the Peacock like documentary. That's all.
He made the Peacock documentary.
Yeah.
He was the producer of it. But he said in the Rogan podcast that it wasn't his idea. He got like pitched that idea later, and they brought him on.
Okay.
So it was like already an idea by somebody, and then he became the director or producer of it later on after it had already been. He talked about Vrindavan. He went to Vrindavan and was, Bhima Karma at the end of the Peacock documentary does this like ceremony for his dad.
Yeah.
And so he was there. That guy David was there for recording it.
And the clip that I saw, David talks about how like moving that ceremony was, or how powerful. I think it's like Bhima Karma and his brother, right?
Yes.
Who's also in the documentary.
Yes.
Which we can talk about. But I guess to get to the point of like why you and I are sitting here talking about this.
Yes. Because initially, I remember very specifically, we're like, we're not going to touch this.
Yes. Initially, we said we're not going to touch this. And part of that is the Krishnangi mantra. Right. Krishna, every time I like
my sister.
Every time I leave the house to come and do a podcast with Nam, like Krishnangi's mantra is like, don't be too provocative. Don't be too provocative.
Yeah.
So part of it was that, but part of it honestly was, I was just like, man, like, I don't want to like call more attention to this thing than it needs, than it deserves. I think a little bit of it, to be honest, is like this kind of like, maybe it's a little old school mentality, but like I came up, and we've talked about this before. I came up in Krishna consciousness at a time where it was like, you were really particular, at least the people that were like sort of mentoring me were really particular about sort of what information we were privy to, right? Mm-hmm. And I don't mean that in a way that like people kept things from us, although maybe that is like a little bit of it. But it was like the sense of like, look, for your bhakti right now and in your development of bhakti, like, do you need to be going down these, what we would now call rabbit holes, right? I don't think we called them rabbit holes back then. And some of us still discovered stuff, and we like kind of, checked out certain controversies and things like that.
Yeah.
So it wasn't like I didn't know stuff was happening, but I think there was like this sense in which, if someone were like, if their faith was a little bit more, tender and developing, you didn't want them exposed to too much like of the craziness. You're like, there's going to be time for that later for them to like, once they've got the foundation laid.
Yeah.
And I bring that up because I think I'm still like locked into that way of thinking, but that's not the way the world is anymore, right?
Yeah, totally not.
So even like your pod or, our pod, this pod,
yeah.
There are, I have, friends and students who are really new to Krishna consciousness.
Yeah.
And in some cases, they may not even identify as devotees, or they may not be familiar with, even the basics of the philosophy, but they're really interested in tuning into the pod and hearing stuff.
I know it's been like, that's a struggle for me.
I would imagine,
internally,
right?
For sure.
So part of the thing of like, we're not going to touch the Peacock documentary is like, look, what if there's some kid out there, I say kid, but like whatever, at whatever age, but someone who's just like, they get a lot of inspiration out of this pod. They get a lot of inspiration out of, other sort of devotional content online.
Yeah.
And they don't even know about this Peacock documentary, this docuseries. And we do a pod on it. They're like, oh, I got to check that out. And they watch it and it messes with their head, right? That was my original thinking.
Totally.
I don't think that's just like, I've had a change of heart. I really feel like
That's so interesting.
I don't even know if I'd call it a change of heart as much as like, I think I just have to like throw in the towel and like admit like, that's just not the time we're living in anymore. Like we're living in an age, for better or for worse, I think, where everyone's got access to everything. And
literally Google anything.
You could literally Google anything. And like, I mean, like talking about rabbit holes, like, you know, the sort of like millennials and Gen Z Zoomers, I feel like they're like hardwired to rabbit hole like we were never before. Like it's just the second like something comes up, they're on Reddit, they're like, you know, they're Googling away. They're deep into like stuff that like I would never even have like imagined. That wouldn't even be my first instinct. So yeah, just thinking about it more. And then when I saw this little clip that you had sent of Joe Rogan interviewing the filmmaker, and then I was actually coincidentally, I was recently in New Vrindavan and talking to some old friends. It just sort of felt like, you know, maybe we're doing a disservice by avoiding it. Maybe it's better to just like talk about it and, you know, and even like the idea of like sheltering someone or, you know, shielding them from, you know, content. Like, again, I think it comes from a good place maybe, but, like at the end of the day, like it is what it is. And I feel like, yeah, like I've just been like reflecting on it and thinking like, no, maybe we should engage with stuff like that. Maybe the fact that, you know, we were like, oh, we don't want to touch this, you know, at least for me, I'm not going to speak for you, but I think for me, some of that was also like, yeah, some of that stuff is very personal. And I was like, maybe I don't want to go there. I'm a little afraid to go there.
I think a lot of people think like you did, because I've gotten experiences where people who are out doing more outreach to like very new people, they won't engage with my podcast or share something or like something for fear of like opening that door and then coming to my like podcast world and see people coming and be like totally overwhelmed by something that all the different content there is on my channel. And before I was like a little bit hurt by that, like, but then I understood that, yeah, I understand that's a thing, and I kind of got over it. But the fact that you're saying that it's open to everyone anyways, and people are gonna Google and do all kinds of stuff anyway, so might as well engage with it, which I appreciate that. I mean, it's mature and a good way to look at it. Yeah,
I had a friend, yeah, and this connects to the Peacock documentary, but I have a friend who's also like a student, who's also like someone deeply inspired by Bhakti, but also kind of maybe keeps their distance a little bit.
Sure.
Anyway, complicated, right? We're all complicated people.
Yeah.
And so this friend goes to me, it's like at the end of a conversation we had recently. They're like, oh my gosh, I almost forgot to tell you. Like, I recently got a subscription to Peacock, and like my heart sank because I was like, I knew what was coming next, right? I was like, oh, don't say it, don't say it, don't say it. And then they're like, and there's like all these like bonus episodes of The Office on there. It's awesome. And I was like, yeah, it's great. But for that split second, I was like, oh, here we go. I'm going to have to get into this whole conversation about New Vrindavan and this and that. And
But the thing is, we all had that feeling when we started watching the Peacock documentary. But by the end of it, we're like, this was awesome.
I know. Well, that's the other thing, right? Like I was bracing myself, you know, and we can talk a little bit about the content maybe, but I was bracing myself, and I was also like, look, I have to watch it, right? Like I cannot watch this thing. I have to like know, like I almost felt like a sense of responsibility. Like I got to know what's out there, but I was just like gritting my teeth and like bracing myself like, oh, this is going to be bad. This is going to be bad. This is going to be bad. And look, at the end of the day, I'm not sure if I would say I'm happy that it was made. You know, I think between like having a documentary, having no documentary about it, I'd probably take no documentary. But if there's going to be like a docuseries, I feel like they did a good job. And I feel like, you know, some things I took, you know, exception with, or like I you know, feel like they didn't quite get right. But a lot of stuff, I thought it was just like nuanced and sensitive and sympathetic, and, you know, not in a way that they like took it easy. I mean, it was like hard hitting, like they didn't pull any punches, I don't think. but I think they did it in a way that like tries to give this like holistic picture of what happened rather than just, you know, go for the cheap shots.
Yeah.
Some of the marketing felt like a little cheap, but I think that's the nature of marketing. If you want to get eyes on a, you know, on in these days, especially with so much competition in the streaming world, like you have to have provocative, you know, trailers, and
The more provocative, the better, especially
Right.
when it's around like something cultish or something.
yeah. So I think it's funny because we call it the Peacock documentary, like none of us call it by its actual title, but it's like something like Krishnas,
Krishnas. Murder
murder, something, right? Like, I mean, fill in the blank, like murder, guns, blah, blah, gurus, something.
Yeah,
you know?
gurus, guns, and murder or something.
Something like that, right?
Yeah.
I don't know, and it's like, it's very like stark, and there's like, you know, there's like a picture, there's like a picture of like Kirtan Ananda, who's like the main focus of it, Kirtan Ananda, aka Kitam, aka Bhaktipad,
yeah.
aka number one. Did you know like one of his nicknames at New Vrindavan was number one?
His nickname was number one.
Yeah.
What, just like number one.
Yeah, I don't know how it was used. And like I certainly, we can get into my own intersection with New Vrindavan, because that's part of also why I wanted to talk about it.
Yeah,
on the
I mean,
pod.
you spent time there when he was there.
Yeah. I mean, in a very weird, like, I would say sort of like, I'm like I wouldn't be like in a book about New Vrindavan or a
Right.
documentary about it, but I'd be like in a footnote maybe somewhere. There'd be like, you know, when you had these like really random footnotes, like interestingly, like
Yeah.
blah, blah, you know, like,
Bro, same with me at the sanctuary.
yeah, that's right.
07.
Because so we both have these like sort of footnote type of relationship. Mine went a little bit deeper, and we can get into it. But anyway, going back to the nickname thing, it's not something that I heard like directly or that I would have used directly as just like, you know, some like wide-eyed, you know, Indian American kid coming to New Vrindavan. but behind the scenes, apparently it was like people would be like, oh yeah, like, you know, I'm trying to think of a good example where they would be like, well, you know, prasadam will no longer be served at 8:00. And it's like, why is that? It was like, that's number one's orders. Like they would like use it that way. You know what I mean? Like, because and it was just like understood. It was like,
Oh my gosh.
you know, I was like, I don't know. It's
That's wild.
Just interesting little like tidbits, right? But
Yeah.
But anyway, Big Kirtan Ananda, Keith Ham, Bhaktipad, number one. In the trailers and everything, they have like this like really prominent images of him, and like
Yes.
they're not always the most flattering images of him. He's like an interesting guy. He's an interesting person, you know, passed away. But you know, some of these pictures, like he looks really intense and kind of like.
Do you remember that part in Rogan where he was like, the guy looks unhinged. Like,
Yeah.
Like just by looking at him, I can tell you this is not a spiritual person.
Yeah.
And I was just like, I've seen him so much throughout my whole life that I never thought of it like that. But Rogan, who's like seeing it with fresh eyes, practically, has that kind of opinion about it.
Yeah, when I heard that, I did hear that part of it, and I was like, I'm not sure how I feel about that. I mean, I think he's onto something. Like, to be honest, like you look at these pictures of Kirtan Ananda, and like sometimes, like more often than not, he kind of has like almost this like stereotypical like crazy guy face, right?
Yeah.
But then you look at a lot of pictures of, you know, these like, there's always like that flip side, right? And so it's it's always, and if you're seeing through the eyes of like a kind of like a, you know, a Guru Bhakti Bhav type of thing, you know, you'll see that expression as like kind of a divine madness or something. And, you know, we've got that in our tradition too. I mean, it's
Totally, yeah.
So you know, but Kirtan Ananda is a really interesting figure. I was actually talking to someone about this. I know we're jumping around a little bit, but I was talking to someone recently about this as well as something I've thought about. But, you know, as part of devotee lore, I think most devotees know, especially if you're into sort of ISKCON history, that Kirtan Ananda actually wasn't in the first batch of initiations. Right. So he was the first sannyasi disciple. I think that's his like sort of claim to fame. And although sometimes New Vrindavan would actually just describe him as, would just say like Prabhupada's first disciple. And, you know, but technically speaking, not only was he not Prabhupada's first disciple, he wasn't even in that first batch, you know, the first initiations with Mukunda Maharaj, you know, Mukunda Janaki, who else was in there? Brahmananda, like, you know, that real famous first initiation in New York. And do you know the reason why he wasn't in that batch?
He went to a mental hospital or something?
He was being forcibly held, right? Like he was, I don't know what they call institutionalized or something, right?
Yeah.
But he was basically inpatient at the most famous mental hospital in New York. It used to be, it was called Bellevue.
Right.
Hospital's still there, does much more than, but they were just so known for their mental ward that like, I mean, I remember as a kid, like if I was like acting crazy, my mom would be like, should I send you to Bellevue? Like it was just, you would say Bellevue. And if you grew up in New York, if anyone from that time period, if you know New York, it's like Bellevue was like synonymous with like the craziest of the crazy, right? Like in terms of their psych ward. And so the story goes, Kirtan, the ISKCON lore is, and you know, it's true. Kirtananda went to apply for like welfare for the first temple for 26 Second Avenue. Because I think very few of the devotees were working. Maybe Satsuru Maharaj, a couple of others had like jobs. Everyone else was just sort of hanging out at the ashram all day. And Kirtananda wanted to help out, and he wanted to get government funding. So he went. The story, as we understand it, is he goes in like with shaven head, in like, you know, a dhoti and, you know, chadar, and at a time where like no one was doing that, right? And applies. And they take one look at him and they say, well, okay, as part of the process, you're going to need a psych eval. He walks over to Bellevue, which is like the nearest right hospital with a psych department. And the story goes that he thought he was signing up for just like an evaluation, like a formal thing. And he ends up signing himself in. And so he was in, I think he was in for like weeks, right? Several weeks. So much so that, and you know, the word got back to Prabhupada and to the devotees, and Prabhupada would send prasad, I think, for him, and devotees would go visit him. And that was the time of the first initiation. So he missed the first initiation because he was still in Bellevue. He got out of Bellevue, and my understanding is they tried to get him out in all sorts of different ways. It didn't work. Finally, someone was able to get in touch with his parents. And his parents signed him out, even though he was, I think, like 30 something years old. But, you know, they had to basically attest to the fact that they took him home. He may have even stayed home for a little while.
Yeah.
And then like ran away from them.
Wow.
Either they took him home, or like on the way home, he just like bolted from the car or something and just like returned to the, you know, to the temple. The reason I'm bringing it up though, is the way that, you know, at least from the earliest time that I remember hearing that story or being told of that story, I think Hayagriva writes about it in his book, Hare Krishna Explosion. But the way that the story was always presented was, you know, poor Kirtananda, poor Keith, he just, you know, was trying to do a good thing, and they saw him dressed as a devotee, and they just assumed, and they were prejudiced, and they just assumed he's crazy, and they locked him up. And maybe part of that is true. But maybe, just maybe, while he was in there, they were able to diagnose that maybe he was actually, I mean, knowing what we know now.
Interesting.
Maybe at the time they were onto something.
Right.
I would be really curious. What was the diagnosis?
That's so interesting.
Because later, of course, later in life.
When did you think of this?
I you know, it was something that like, it's just kind of bubbling around for a while.
Yeah.
And I don't even know how you get your hands on like something like, it's like probably like sealed documents or something. But I'd be really curious if there was someone who knew or who had like a copy of, from way back then, whatever it was, 60, what would it have been, 67? 67.
Yeah.
What did they diagnose Kirtananda with? And was it an accurate diagnosis? Could it have been something, right? Like now, after the fact, I think devotees, you could say speculate, or, you know, devotees based on their own experience are like, I'm pretty sure we could at least say, if not like sort of, you know, being a sociopath, which many people do feel he was a sociopath, at least like narcissistic personality disorder, some kind of schizophrenia, some kind of like malignant.
And then even more so after the injury.
Well, that's the thing also, right? Because usually when you have traumatic, I think they call them TBIs or some traumatic brain injuries. And you can tell, you're going to be able to tell in about 2 seconds how not a medical professional I am and how like out of my depths I am when I say this. But I believe that the term is, it stirs shit up. Like, but you know, in all seriousness, right? When you have like, this is what I've heard or what I've read, traumatic brain injuries, it's if there is a pre-existing, I think it's very rare for a traumatic brain injury to like, I'm sure it happens, but it's rare for it to just cause something like completely new. But if there's already some kind of neurological something, either like a psychiatric, psychological, neurological, right? There's so much about the brain, mind kind of sphere that we like, at best we're guessing about. But traumatic brain injuries can kind of, stir things up or bring things maybe to the forefront that were always there, but were more like managed.
Yeah.
So I think it wouldn't be implausible. Let me put it this way. I don't think it's an implausible theory that, and this is actually what I kind of personally have come to believe, that Kirtananda, maybe from his like earliest days, from his childhood, had some, either a mental disorder or a series of mental disorders, was also an incredibly intelligent person, which I think is pretty universally accepted from, by those who had interaction with him. Right. I've even heard like words like brilliance thrown around, like genius, brilliance.
I can give you an anecdote about that.
Yeah, I would love to hear it. My theory is he had one or more mental disorders. He was able to manage them and also maybe compensate for them with really kind of like a sharp like intellect. I think they caused struggles throughout his devotional career. And I think, after, I think it was like late 85 or early 86, I'm weak on my dates, but after, he gets this traumatic brain injury, which, is a result of a pretty serious, I mean, the word I've often heard used is braining. He was brained, right? Like there's it's like a piece of metal. And it was like, I think it like actually penetrated and like stabbed him into the skull.
Oh, really? I thought it was just like hitting.
I'm not sure if it was a stabbing or hitting, but like from what the way I remember it being described, and I think it's fairly accurate, although it's hard, right? Because there's so much of it is like the legend, the myth, more than reality. But it was serious. It was serious enough that I think they
thought he was going to die.
They thought he was going to die from it, right?
Yeah.
I think a serious enough injury like that probably, and this is again my working theory, probably made it so that stuff that he was able to sort of contain and manage, like suddenly was just like on the forefront. And it's so unfortunate and it's so tragic. I mean, that's like an understatement. But by that point, he also had so much power.
Yes.
So it's like the perfect storm, right? You have, again, if there's truth to my theory, you have this, serious like mental disorder, disturbance, dysfunction, whatever you want to call it. You have it triggered, but you have it triggered in someone who now has near absolute power and who has followers who are not going to question and don't feel safe questioning. And suddenly he's doing all this weird stuff. I mean, weird stuff that that's being excused as divine vision, as inspiration, as creativity, as right, like as the sort of the genius of the acharya.
People love to criticize him and the devotees who were there at that time for like, you guys didn't do anything and this and that.
Right. It was so obvious. How could you not?
Obvious.
Yeah.
But listen, how I heard it was that Prabhupada told them in New Vrindavan that he is like my representative.
Yes.
You have to follow him, and that means you're following me. I don't know if he said it in those words, but I'm saying, basically paraphrasing.
Yeah.
Now, when a disciple of Prabhupada hears that, if you're not in that position, people who are criticizing, if you're not in that position, you don't know how you would react also.
That's fair.
That's the way I've heard it, and it makes sense to me. Of course, it doesn't, like, it's not like, bypassing it or whatever, but
right.
I can understand like why. I mean, there was so many people who I know that when that started to happen, they were just like, we're out of here. We're not gonna challenge anything, but we're just gonna leave.
Yeah.
So, I just don't like it when people criticize like that whole generation or that whole group of devotees who were there at the time that you didn't do anything. It's like you weren't there, and you didn't do anything either. Like even if you were there, you wouldn't have done anything. You don't know how you would have reacted.
Yeah.
And if the founder Acharya said something like that to you, Would you be like, no, I'm not going to listen to you about that? Everyone, it was just like the mood of the time.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I agree with you. I struggle with that a lot though, because I agree with you. I also think like we're complicated people, right? And I don't think there's one single answer. Like you said, there are really thoughtful devotees that were like, at the first signs of things, they were like, I'm out of here.
Yeah.
And I respect them.
Yeah.
And there were really thoughtful devotees who were like, we're going to stick it through it.
Stick it through it.
And there were thoughtful devotees who were like, this is a little weird, but it's not that bad. And then it gets a little weirder. And right. So everyone has different natures, different personalities.
Yeah.
There's some of us that we have that fight or flight instinct, maybe for whatever reason, our childhood, and we're like just very strong on it. Like, nope, I'm out of here.
Yeah.
And there's others that, you know, we're like, and I almost hate to bring it up because it's like such a cliche, but it just works so well for like, you know, it's sort of the analogy that's often given for like cultic groups and stuff like that is like the sort of like how you boil, what is it, like a frog or something? Do you know about this?
Skin a cat?
No, that's a different one. But it's like something about, gosh, I'm going to mess it up now. But I think it's like when you boil a frog or something, I don't know why you'd want to boil a frog, or lobster or something, but it's like you gradually turn up the temperature.
Oh, yeah.
You know what I'm talking about
I know
now?
what you're talking about. Yeah.
And so whatever, let's say frog, because that's the way I remember it for some weird reason. I don't know, maybe a French person told it to me and they're like, when you boil the frog, I don't know. But when the whole thing is, right, if you were to take a frog and throw it into like boiling hot water or whatever, like it would probably just like freak out and like jump out, right?
Yeah.
But the whole thing, according to, at least I've never tried it, but according to the analogy is, you know, you gradually increase the temperature and it's just like tolerates that much more. It tolerates that much more. It tolerates that much more until, you know, all of a sudden it looks around and it's like, I'm in a vat of boiling water, right?
Yeah.
And it's too late. You're like, you're sunk by then.
Yeah.
And it's a little morbid, but like that's often the analogy that's given for these like really dysfunctional kind of cultic environments where it's like, you just like, you turn up the crazy just a little bit. It's just a little bit more like, you know, a little bit off, a little bit weirder.
Yeah.
And you tolerate, and some of us again, and this is my point. It's like, it's not fair to approach it like a one size fits all and just condemn the person who left immediately or condemn the person who stayed, because, you know, we're just different people. And for some people, they're just like maybe a little bit more wired or predisposed to like just tolerate a little bit more and stay in that. And it's sad. And the part that I struggle with is like, because I agree with you. I don't like that criticism. And especially when that criticism is directed against people that like I care deeply for and I respect, I sort of take offense to it. But my take on it is also like something you said, you know, I think at the tail end of your comments where you were like, it was the way I heard it, I think you used a phrase like it was just like the time, right? And I think that's the part of it also that like, it was very much the time, not just at New Vrindavan. That's the thing that I think a lot of devotees really don't want to admit. Maybe it was like most extreme in New Vrindavan, but New Vrindavan was just a microcosm of a greater sort of, you know, dysfunctionality that was happening all throughout the movement.
Yeah.
And maybe it didn't show up in the same ways in more like sophisticated, savvy places, because like farm communities in general and New Vrindavan in particular, you know, are always a little bit more, it's like a bubble within a bubble, a cult within a cult kind of thing, for a variety of reasons. It's a commune, right? At a time when by the 80s, most city temples were much less communal than they had been in the 70s. But into the 80s, right? Places like New Vrindavan were still very much operating like a commune in the old school, like 60s, 70s definite, right? So very isolationist, right? Kind of world. And that mood was just there.
Yeah.
And so I don't feel like it's fair, especially for devotees who may have been in that mood in somewhere else, to then turn around and go, oh, like these people in New Vrindavan, anyone who stayed in New Vrindavan was either, you know, crazy or complicit or something. Like I've heard people say that, and I'm just like, I don't think that's fair. Mm-hmm. It's also, and again, I don't want to get into trouble here, right? Trying to remember the don't be too provocative thing.
Yes.
But the truth of the matter is, as crazy as it was, and it was crazy, how do I put this? I think the same devotees that would be like, oh my gosh, like how could anyone have like followed Bhaktipad Kirtananda, and done, all this crazy stuff, or stayed with him throughout all this crazy stuff and defended him. You could just switch the whole equation just a tiny bit if you're like, and I'm not saying this happened, but if like when Prabhupada was, with us, when he was, or with, with the devotees, when he was physically on the planet alive, if Prabhupada had said something really extreme or did something really extreme, the vast majority of those devotees, I don't think they would have booked it. I think they would have like tried to roll with it and tried to understand. And maybe it's hard for them to imagine someone looking at Kirtananda the way that they looked at Prabhupada.
Yeah.
And I'm not trying to equate Kirtananda and Prabhupada in terms of their spiritual qualifications, but I'm trying to say if you just in the mood of empathy, try to imagine what it's like for someone who is seeing Kirtananda as not just a connection to Prabhupada, but like almost like synonymous with it. Like, I think it just has to change the equation a little bit. You have to just see their willingness to put up with whatever in just like another light. I'm not excusing stuff that happened, but I'm saying, to your point, like, yeah, I don't think it's fair or helpful to just write them off.
Yeah. I think there was in the documentary, what kind of, it was like disturbing, but then it got like next level disturbing when it was like the child abuse stuff came up.
Yeah.
And that was like I knew most of that stuff, but it was like to see it visually on the documentary was very disturbing for me. It was just like, it was like, well, this is bad, like it got real bad over there.
Yeah. Yeah. And, I think like, there's stuff.
And David talked about it a lot in the podcast, in the Rogan podcast too.
Okay.
Like, because Rogan didn't know about it. So he was asking, like, David talked about it, and then Rogan would ask more questions about it. So he would unpack it even more.
Yeah.
About like pedophilia and things like that, which was, it was horrible.
So it's so hard to hear.
It's like so different to hear that in what I grew up with in ISKCON. Everyone who's a Prabhupada disciple is like worshipable and always has done good things, and we only look at the good things, and so it's like a really different way of looking at it that I'm not used to, honestly.
Yeah. It was hard. It was really hard. I think that was like the hardest thing as well. In some ways, like the other stuff, like in terms of the, like, I mean, they do get into like murders that were committed, that are believed to have been like ordered or sanctioned by Kirtananda for very political reasons. And, I don't want to spoil it for anyone who hasn't seen the documentary,
right?
Because it's worth watching. If you are going to get into this stuff, it's like, but as disturbing as that is, in a way, I agree with you that like the sort of the extent of and the nature of the child abuse, like, just hit harder almost in a way. And I don't mean to be dismissive of people losing their lives, like that's serious, but it's almost like, like next level trauma and pain when you think about like, there's some of the devotees that are interviewed in that. I think I may disagree with, we may have our own opinions about different things, whatever, but I deeply respect and appreciate how, they just shared their stories, and it was really like, I appreciate that. I also appreciate, and I heard a little bit I want to hear the whole Joe Rogan podcast, but I heard a little bit of the interview with David where David is saying, the way I heard it, David was sharing that as bad as the child abuse was and is, that he was also really struck by how the institution or certain people within, certain leaders within the institution, whatever, have really tried to like own up to it and address it. And, I have a little bit of experience in terms of, I was working with Anuttama Prabhu, with, in ISKCON Communications. I just started working with ISKCON Communications when that lawsuit, the child abuse lawsuit, when we reached a settlement.
Oh.
And so I remember like I was like we used to have press releases in those days, the Turley case. So this was like pre, Twitter or X or anything. So we used to like when news broke, it would be like you'd write like a press release, or you'd either be responding or you'd write a press release. And I remember one of the first things like I did, I remember the two like major sort of early assignments I had was, one was to draft the press release for Bhakti Swami's passing away.
Oh, right.
And that one was one that we had like, you know, once we knew it was like, it could be any day. I mean, I think he ended up living like, a couple of months after we initially drafted it, but we had like a press release ready to go because that's what you usually do. Like,
It's like 20 years ago now.
yeah, it's been 20
Is
years.
that wild?
That's so wild. But the other one was the, you know, and I'm not sure of the exact dates, but it was the Turley lawsuit settlement. And I remember it was like New York Times. Like I remember it was like pretty big news. And while it's incredibly, I'm not trying to like say like silver linings or make, you know, I'm not trying to do that, like put like a positive spin on it, which, you know, sometimes communications people get accused of being like spin doctors, where I'm not trying to spin it. But I honestly have to say that, you know, I think ISKCON as an institution could do a lot of things better, and certainly could have done a lot of things better in the past. I'll say with this one, all things considered, I think, and the filmmaker David, he noted this, like, I think the institution did a pretty decent job of like owning up and trying to make things right. I'm sure that there are going to be, you know, listeners or viewers to this podcast who disagree, and that's fine.
Oh yeah, they're gonna completely disagree.
But, you know, to each his own. I think relative to other religious organizations, relative to even secular organizations like the Boy Scouts of America, who had a huge and really, I mean, you want to talk about like something that's going to like disturb you. If you do any research on the Boy Scouts of America and the amount of child abuse, particularly, you know, sexual abuse that's taken place, it's staggering. It's like devastating. You'll just like weep. It's devastating.
Oh, I didn't know that.
You know, again, it's not a whataboutism thing, but relatively speaking, I feel like there is something to appreciate in terms of what, you know, institutional response, in terms of certain devotees really stepping up to the plate. And I think they should be acknowledged and named and celebrated. And I think, you know, devotees I can think of like Anuttama and Rukmini Devi and others who really, you know, started efforts and organizations like Children of Krishna or the Children's Fund and things like that. So, you know, there's that piece of the story too, but I agree with you that was part of the docu-series that was especially painful. And look, that's a really dark part of New Vrindavan's history. It's funny because, I mean, not funny is not the word, but it's, you know, there's a certain, I guess, irony or a certain, there's something really like, now looking back on it, that like kind of almost gives me like chills. I started going to New Vrindavan when I was young, right? Like I started going to, so I don't know how much we've talked about this before, but, or how many folks know.
We haven't. Yeah.
We haven't gotten into this, right? Like my connection to Krishna consciousness was not through ISKCON as an organization. My connection to Krishna consciousness, to Krishna bhakti, whatever we want to call it, to our tradition, to Prabhupada, to all this stuff, Mahaprabhu, etc., was all through New Vrindavan and the organization. And at the time, when I say that, what I mean for those who are maybe newer to this and are like, well, what do you mean? Isn't New Vrindavan part of ISKCON? Well, at the time, it was not. At the time, it was completely outside of ISKCON. It was its own organization. The organization was called
Interfaith League of Devotees.
ILOD, ILOD, the Interfaith. We didn't really use ILOD. It didn't have the same ring as ISKCON. But Interfaith League of Devotees, which was a kind of a riff on the original organization that Prabhupada started, the pre-ISKCON organization. That was in Jhansi.
Jhansi, yeah.
Prabhupada started something called the League of Devotees. It was like part of his experimentation of kind of going out on his own, instead of just being affiliated with one of the Gaudiya Mutts to do his own thing. He came up with, you know where they get League of Devotees from?
No.
Oh, I thought, come on, man, you're a history major.
League of Devotees.
What other famous league can you think of? No?
Baseball league?
No. Major, yeah, it's true. Major League Baseball, right? No, it was a precursor to the United Nations, was called the League of Nations.
Oh.
And I'm pretty sure that's where Prabhupada, I mean, I would imagine that's where Prabhupada got the inspiration, because that would have been, otherwise it's kind of like, where did that come from, right? But anyway, League of Devotees was short-lived, and then Prabhupada clearly, like, you know, if he wanted to, he could have established League of Devotees here. He didn't.
He was a critic of United Nations.
Yeah. Well, League of Nations was even, I think, worse. I think League of Nations was like totally flopped.
Right.
And
Just
then
a bunch of flags.
it was
Everybody
just,
used to say that.
yeah, bro, I would say that just a bunch of flags.
If you go there, it's just flags.
That's so funny. Anyway, there's a story with that too, which maybe we'll come back to at some point. But,
So your connection was
but
with
my connection
New
was through New
Yeah.
Vrindavan, which was Interfaith League of
how old
Devotees.
were you?
And I was so we figured this out the other day. I think I was younger than my daughter is now, which is really weird for me to think about. But I must have been first visit. I must have been maybe I just turned 13,
Wow.
something like that.
I remember you telling me some things like you remember being in that main quad area that's New Vrindavan right now, and in the new temple, like in the temple where the doors are above, there's a porch of some sort, or like a patio kind of thing on the outside. No, like what's that called? He used to come out and like lecture from up there.
Oh, like a balcony.
Oh,
like
the balcony, yeah.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of like.
Remember you telling me that?
Yeah, I don't know if I was there personally for that, but I mean, there was all sorts of stuff like
You
that.
remember him from that time?
I do remember him from that time. Well, so you want to hear like really like how weird this gets? I think my first visit, maybe my first couple of visits, he wasn't there because he was already under arrest.
Oh,
he was
in house arrest.
He was under house arrest, and I think because I think he was in. There were two, and I get them confused. But there were two periods of time where he was under house arrest. Also, a lot of people don't know, like just as a little FYI, like criminal proceedings take a long time, and there's a lot of like back and forth and appeals, and his case just went like back and forth and appeals. So there's a whole timeline to this, which gets very sort of like complicated because he's in, he's out. He's physically present at New Vrindavan sometimes he's not allowed to be. So when we first started visiting, it was I think it was the first time he was under house arrest in maybe Wheeling or one of the like small towns, but it was definitely off the property. I think that was one of the stipulations, was that he could not set foot on the property during that time. Okay. Then later that was changed, and I did, interact with him on the property. But the first, I think 2 visits, he was under house arrest. And just to let you know how wild it is, and also just to let you know how the human mind is capable of just making sense of things that are really, like in hindsight, really kind of like wacky and should have been a red flag or whatever.
Yeah.
It might have been my second visit, not my first, but definitely one of the early visits that my family made. He would give Bhagavatam class from where he was under house arrest. And they would have like a speakerphone that was like on like the Vyasasana.
Whoa.
And it was like a picture of him. This wasn't his main. So he had a main Vyasasana that was next to Prabhupada's. And that had like a full-sized picture of him, like, proper, like a altar picture type of thing. And then there was a smaller asana that the Bhagavatam speaker would sit on, but when he gave class, which I would imagine was either frequently or it was like some regularly scheduled special treat kind of thing,
we're doing a podcast.
Okay, let me take it back. So on the Vyasasana, they would put the speakerphone and he would give the class while being under house arrest. And so that was my first interaction with Kirtananda was, if you want to call it that, was, sitting in this class. It was like in real time. It wasn't a pre-recorded class. He was giving class. He gave his Bhagavatam class, which, oddly, I think my dad was really impressed with, which was really kind of interesting. He was like, oh, he's a very smart man or something. But he gave his class and then he asked for it was Q&A. And I think I very shyly, very hesitatingly asked a question.
What? And
And then it was like either he heard it directly or maybe someone relayed the question to him more clearly over the speakerphone. And I can't remember what the question was. I can't remember what the answer was, but it was it was a positive experience for sure. But yeah, but I was 13. I was a kid myself. And the thing that now I look back on and I think, wow, now it kind of gives me chills is I would see I would see the kids from the community, like those first couple of visits, right? Like Gurukulis, and some of whom became very dear friends, like later as we sort of grew older, kind of in these weird parallel worlds where like I would visit and they lived there, and you know, very different backgrounds, but in some ways kind of like some similarities. But initially I would be so what's the word? I would be so like almost like envious, and I just thought they must have like the best life ever.
Because they live in New Vrindavan.
Because they live in New Vrindavan. It was like the place that to me was like, it was heaven on earth. It was, you know, it was like a little portal had opened up to Goloka Vrindavan. I mean, I bought it like hook, line, and sinker in terms of like, you know, it's the Dham. It's non-different than Vrindavan, which I hadn't been to like Vrindavan in India. Yeah. So I would say that, never having even been to the like Vrindavan in India, but in my mind, New Vrindavan was. It got to the point, and you know, part of this is like my own sort of youthful fanaticism, but it was to the point where it was almost like I don't need to go to like the Vrindavan in India, like, you know.
Prabhupada said this is non-different.
This is non-different, and I just fully accept it. But it was like what would it be like to be a kid, you know, growing up, like to be like a bridge bossy, to be like an inmate, right? That was the other thing they used to call like New Vrindavan inmates, right? In like in an endearing way. And I was like, oh, like it was the stuff that like in my like fantasy of fantasies was like, you know, oh, to be a bridge bossy, to be like a kid, you know. It's like 91, something like that. I mean, like, I had no idea what was going on, right? I couldn't have who, you know, what like visiting 13-year-old, you know, Hindu American kid from like New York would have been privy to that, right? So I didn't know obviously what was going on behind the scenes, but it's so strange to think about now, like how in its own way, like how deeply I had like internalized this thing of like, these kids must be the happiest people on planet Earth right now. And it's like, not only were they not the happiest people on planet Earth, but like there was such suffering that I wish I could like, you know.
You're still in touch with some of them now?
I am. Yeah, I am.
Are they like, what's their mood towards New Vrindavan?
I feel like, you know, it's impossible to generalize. It's that thing if we're all complex people. And I think for some of them, they're like, good riddance. Like, I never want to set foot there again. I mean, it really ranges. Yeah. And I should say, like, you know, full disclosure, caveat that I wouldn't say I'm like incredibly close, you know, but I think we have enough of a friendship that it's like, we may not be in touch, you know, on the regular, but like whenever we see each other, whenever our paths cross, whenever, you know, whenever it happens, there's genuine warmth and love there, I think, you know, and I think there always will be, even if we may have very different sort of experiences and views, but it really ranges, Nam. It ranges from like, I have friends who are like, yeah, it's like even setting foot there, it's like, you know, I don't know if I would say they want to like, you know, see the place burnt to the ground, but they definitely don't want to be there themselves. Yeah. On the one end of the spectrum, maybe, and on the other end of the spectrum, I have friends who I have, you know, a friend and someone I really look up to who I was just reconnected with him in New Vrindavan, and he comes regularly and, you know, even finds ways of being connected and helping. And, and one of the things I really appreciate, and I'm not saying, you know, one is right, one is wrong, because again, that takes us back to the whole like thing of why do some people leave? Why did some people stay? Why did some people react this way? Why do some people react that way? It's like, I just feel like we try so hard to fit everyone into boxes.
Totally.
And it just doesn't work that way. Right. Yeah. And so no disrespect to those who don't see value in constructively being connected to New Vrindavan, working with New Vrindavan. But for those who do, I especially really admire and respect that, because I think a lot of them from their own experiences are finding ways to positively change the culture, right? To be like, you know, this place was and is a special place. It has special promise. A lot of that promise has gone unfulfilled. There have been serious detours and deviations, but there's also been a lot of resilience. And at least some of these friends of mine who lived through it and who are, you know, I guess what we would call like New Vrindavan Gurukulis or Gurukul alum, they see it even as part of their, maybe even their dharma. They see it as really something that maybe Krishna is like pushing them towards, to help to really kind of positively change the culture so that, you know, New Vrindavan can recover from those detours and deviations and turning into something it was never meant to be, and maybe even live up to the potential that, you know, Srila Prabhupada and so many really sincere, earnest devotees wanted it to be.
David mentioned that in the podcast because Rogan asked, like, is that place still like functioning? And
Oh, he
David,
asked that,
yeah.
yeah.
And David was like, oh yeah, it's actually a really nice place. He was saying, he's like, there's really nice people there now, and they really turned it around. And Rogan was like really surprised. He's like, oh wow, it's still like he called it a commune. It's like still a commune, and it's still, and David was saying really positive things about it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which
well,
is really, I mean, it's definitely to the credit of the devotees there to you know, turn it around, so to say.
Yeah. Yeah. I think technically it's pretty far from a commune now.
Oh yeah.
You know, in terms of just, and that's part of, I think, like the growth and development, but it's I think it is now much more like, maybe not 100% there, but it's much closer to, I think, a healthy functioning community. That's, you know, where people can be individuals in every sense, in terms of, you know, literally like owning their own stuff and resources and having, you know, their own space, but also being more sort of having the ability to like be more independently thoughtful, as I think like Prabhupada coined that phrase, independently thoughtful. And so I would hope, and I do believe, even if we're not 100% there, that, you know, a place like New Vrindavan today, I don't think the craziness that did happen there, I don't think it could happen in the same way today, just because I think there has been that positive shift in culture where there's enough devotees who would be able to say, like, no, this is not right. We can't go down this road, right? And I think that has to do with a culture shifting. I'm not saying that to blame those in the past. I'm not saying that to like, you know, ascribe some superhuman powers to those, you know, right now, because we are all still people, and we're flawed, and we see what we want to see, and all that kind of stuff. But I think culturally, there's been such a shift towards healthiness.
Definitely. I remember the first time I went there, in Prabhupada's Palace of Gold, they had Prabhupada dressed with a crown and a scepter.
Really?
I remember that.
You
Distinctly
remember that?
Yeah.
So that means that was.
It was like the mid to earlier 90s. Not early as 91 or anything like that.
No, it would have been, it would have still been mid 90s. Yeah.
Yeah, mid 90s. I remember that. I was like asking my dad about it or something, and he wasn't so sure either. And but it was just like, oh, it was actually a really cool thing.
Oh, you liked it? Yeah.
I remembered, like, because it was so different. It was like, oh, Prabhupada's wearing a crown, like a king's crown,
like
a
scepter, like what like King Charles wears in England, right? Like a European, British kind of.
Yeah, and it was like that specific temple where Prabhupada dresses like a king.
And he had like a cape that was like,
yes.
There's a word for it which is escaping me, but it has like a faux fur kind of thing.
A fur thing, and then
it ties over here.
Connected. Yeah,
and then like a scepter, and that was the whole. You know, that was actually one of the early things that Kirsananda introduced, and there was somewhere I have somewhere in my old files a copy of, because I was just like an ISKCON history buff and a New Vrindavan history buff, but I have like photocopies of the GBC meetings where they were like arguing that.
Really?
It was a thing. It went up to the GBC level of like, you know, is this, and then they gave Kirsananda, like they gave New Vrindavan sort of like provisional permission to do it or something. Wow. I mean, he did it anyway, and it was like by that point it was like, you know, it was sort of like they were just trying to make it look like, you know, like, okay, yeah, we give you permission. And he's like I need your permission. Right? There was that kind of mood already.
Right.
But that you know, Prabhupada wearing the crown thing actually ends up being, although it seems like a rather like, you know, inconsequential or you know, like almost like a sort of like just like a weird detail, it ended up being like a real sort of it was like the crack in the foundation that like ultimately, resulted in this rift or New Vrindavan being, excommunicated or Kirtananda being excommunicated. It was sort of like what a lot of people, a lot of devotees recognize as like the first sort of like, it was Kirtananda dipping his toe into the waters of weirdness as far as like what was like to come. There's also another
Jesus on the altar.
Jesus was installed, I think, in 87.
Dogs in the temple room.
Dogs in the temple room. I mean, they were like, I don't think there was like any dogs. I don't think it was like, bring your dog day to the temple. I think it was more like, it was his dogs, because after he got attacked, he had these guard dogs. Yeah. He had one in particular. There may have been more. I mean, there was like a lot of German shepherds around because I think they were like breeding them at that point, right? But his main guard dog was called Gudakesh. Because the lore was that he was like the best guard. Like Gudakesh means conqueror of sleep, right? It's like a name of Arjuna. It's like one who like never sleeps.
Right.
And it was like that Gudakesh never slept. He was just like 24 hours.
Oh my God.
Gudakesh was nasty towards everyone except Kirtananda and maybe like one or two people like close to him. But Gudakesh, he was trained to be like, he was trained to be like a killer guard dog, right? Mm-hmm. That was the idea. And he was always by Kirtananda's side. So I remember in New Vrindavan him being in the temple room. I also remember him being in the temple room of the satellite center that was in New York at the time that no longer exists, but it was in a neighborhood in Brooklyn called Greenpoint.
Greenpoint, yeah. Greenpoint, Brooklyn.
And I distinctly remember because it was a smaller temple room, and I remember being so freaked out because like I wanted to sit in the front row because I'm like a nerd like that. I'm like one of those front row kids, or at least I was. And I was like, I want to be in the front row and Srila Bhaktipad gives this class, and I sat up there and I realized like that's not a good place to sit because you're like face to face with Gudakesh, like, whoa. And I just have these like memories, and I wasn't like afraid of dogs. I actually had when I was younger. I coincidentally enough, German Shepherds. I had 2 German Shepherds when I was a kid.
Really?
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, when I was a real young kid.
Wow.
So it wasn't like I had like a phobia, but this particular dog, you just got the vibe from him. Like he would rip your head off at any, like if Kirtananda gave the command. And it was like, the mood, like, yes, I'm being a little dramatic maybe, but like the mood was, it was kind of scary. Yeah. But yeah, there was stuff like that. The Prabhupada with the crown thing, another interesting piece of history with that is, the sort of the pro-crown side, the side that was like sympathetic towards it, which by the way was also other devotees outside of New Vrindavan who were also like, what's the big deal? Like Kirtananda is such like a, he was so beloved to Prabhupada and he wants to honor Prabhupada in this way. Like, what's the problem? Like, why are we, there were devotees who held that view, and there's documentation of it too, right? Like, cause like I said, I have this like sort of GBC discussion about it. But one of the things, and an early devotee who caught this is Ravindra Swarup Prabhu, who ended up like kind of going to war with Kirtananda, and who history has proven was definitely onto stuff, right? He was
Sally Jesse Raphael, was it
Larry King live? Yeah, Larry King. Kirtananda's the guest, and Ravindra calls in. Ravindra Prabhu calls in.
Yes.
So Ravindra Prabhu, he connected the dots, and one of the things that he saw was that what Kirtananda was doing. One of the things he was doing with putting that crown on Prabhupada and framing Prabhupada as like this king in his palace, making this whole motif, is he was kind of like creating this narrative where it's like, Prabhupada's the king, he has his palace, and we know what happens with kings, right? Like what happened after Queen Elizabeth died, there can only be one heir. And that heir is now, then the Prince of Wales, Prince Charles, now King Charles, right? So what Kirtananda was subtly doing was he was creating this framework, or he was like using this framework to say like, Prabhupada is the king in his palace, and Prabhupada left us in, right, 1977, and who is the heir? And what's interesting is...
there's a picture of him with the crown and the scepter.
He wore the same kind of crown and same kind of scepter, at least on his Vyasa Puja, his Vyasa Puja day, which I think, I don't know I don't remember what his actual birthday was, but we always used to celebrate it. It was like a 3-day festival. It was Janmashtami, Prabhupada Vyasa Puja, and then Bhaktipad Vyasa Puja, because it was all around the same time. So I don't know TT-wise or whatever, but it was like whatever, early September or something like that.
Wow.
And on his Vyasa Puja day, wouldn't you know it? Same kind of crown, same kind of scepter, same kind of cape, same kind of language. There were T-shirts, and as a lover of like, you know, old school memorabilia, you'd probably, you know, maybe if someone's listening, if you've got one of these T-shirts and you want to send it into Nam, but there were these old T-shirts that you used to be able to get your hands on that said Bhaktipad is king. It had that phrase, Bhaktipad is king. And so it's like, it, on the one hand, seems to be like an innocent or an innocuous sort of glorification of Prabhupada. And maybe, I mean, I'm of the opinion that things are mixed, right? And even with Kirtananda, I think he was a mixed bag. I think he had a lot of genuine love for Prabhupada. I think he also had a lot of his own stuff, like we've talked about. And part of that had to do with, I think a pretty well documented sort of, you know, insecurity / envy of like kind of wanting to be in the position of Prabhupada. It's that kind of like, I love you and I want to be you. Yeah. Kind of, you know, which gets really weird. And we talk about how, especially in terms of like the guru relationship, how that can get very even dangerous. I think Kirtananda always had that. And I think in that mix, there was genuine love for Prabhupada and a genuine desire to glorify Prabhupada. But I think there was also this other piece there where he was a smart person, and he was kind of laying things out to create this master narrative. And in this master narrative, you know, the scepter passes literally and figuratively from Prabhupada, you know, right to him. And devotees like Ravindra Sri Prabhu kind of saw it and called it out and was like, this is not good.
Like in the meeting, he called it out?
He called it out in the meeting. I think he called it out, you know, from what I've heard privately also. I think he, you know, but he saw it as a red flag. Let's put it that way. He saw certain things, and he's not the only one, but he's a good example of someone who saw things as a red flag at New Vrindavan that years later we were like, yeah, you know.
He was right.
He was right. He was right.
Something about the way people say that he was brilliant. Like I saw that.
Yeah, like tell us that story. Yeah,
like when I lived in the Bhakti Center, which used to be called the Sanctuary, and there were his disciples running the restaurant, disciples living in the building, along with ISKCON devotees, Yagipurush Prabhu and his brahmacharis.
So this is like a time of transition.
Yeah, but this is before even.
So this is not like there's no official Bhakti Center.
No, there's nothing official about
that. This is Yagya.
He just Yagya, and he has brahmacharis who live with him.
Right. Yagya and his merry band of brahmacharis.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So they originally lived on like 3rd Street, then it was like 4th Street, and then they were invited to come stay at this building,
right,
25 First Avenue, which
happened to be the Sanctuary.
And it was an amazing restaurant where they had Radha Muralidhar on the 2nd floor. And I remember going there for the first time with you, I think.
To the Sanctuary restaurant?
To the restaurant,
yeah.
I'd never been to like a restaurant as a kid.
I remember.
So we went, there's like a devotee restaurant. And
I remember you were really like enchanted by the idea that they had like bread on the table.
yeah, because it was like karmi bread.
Yeah, you were like eating this bread, and I was like, Amul, hold on, there's gonna be like other food. You're like, like filling up on this bread.
And some salad dressing, I remember.
Oh yeah.
Anyways, so I lived there, and Bhaktipad lived there also.
So you were like roommates with...
He would come in every morning.
Yeah.
And with his wheelchair, and there's a devotee who was taking care of him, would wheelchair him in while we were sleeping in the temple room. And he would come in at like 3:30 or 4. Like Mangalarti wasn't until 5, but he would come in early. He would have his Bhagavad Gita, he'd have his Tulsi Marani with him, he'd chant. How I understood his amazing skill of communication was that he wasn't allowed to give class, but he would speak every time the speaker was like, okay, time for questions. Does anyone have a question? Or comment. He would say something, and he would give his own class afterward.
Right.
And we were all like, we understood why he was a zonal acharya.
Really, even then, because this is like years later.
This is years later. He was like so old.
He's old.
He's super old.
He's sickly.
He can't walk. Yeah, like practically can't walk.
Right. And this is after he's already served his prison sentence.
Yes, it's 2007, and he was brilliant in what he was saying.
Even then,
Yeah. and we were just impressed. Like, I didn't know any of this history. I was a kid. I didn't know any of the history of like all this abuse and murder and blah blah blah. I didn't know any of it. And we were just like, wow, he's like, he met Prabhupada just one block over,
right?
And he helped Srila Prabhupada start the ISKCON movement. He was kind of like a celebrity in some ways.
Yeah.
But I remember Yogya Push Prabhu telling us like, yo, keep your distance, like be careful. Not be careful, but like just like let him do his thing and we're doing our thing and things like that.
Yeah.
And he would I remember distinctly, he came in one day and I think it was either Keshavacharya or Sri Kalachandra was sleeping, and we were all, and they were the last persons to get up. Like they were still sleeping in their sleeping bag. And he was like,
wait, where is this? Is like in the temple room?
In the temple room. And he was wheeled him. And I won't forget what he said. He was like, wake that bastard up. He said it so loud. And we were all just looking at each other like, oh my gosh. He's like, listen to this guy. If he's upset about something. It was just that, I won't ever forget that when he said that. And he would,
I heard he was like a stickler for like waking up early. Is that true?
Oh yeah. Wake up early. And another thing that he had us do was that if you were in the temple, you had to bring something for Krishna, for Radha Murlidhar. So every morning there was like a basket of fruits, and we all had to like go to the deities and offer this like fruit, like just to them, and put it down. And like everyone had to like offer it. It was like weird kind of practice, but like, oh, I was like, okay, well, I'll do that too. Like we all had to do it.
Interesting.
And also, I think maybe Nrsimhadev prayers or something else was all sung in English.
Yeah, well, that I remember from New Vrindavan for sure, because that was definitely part of his program.
Yes.
Right? Because at a certain point, and I think this started probably in 87 in earnest, but maybe they were already starting it earlier. I think the first thing was Bach.
Bach, right.
So at a certain point, I think post-traumatic brain injury, but it may have been before that, Kirtananda just became, I don't want to say obsessed, but like, but maybe obsessed, I don't know, but he became really into like Bach. And I mean, I remember like, so we're jumping around in time, but I remember after the whole like house arrest speakerphone thing was over, and he had appealed and I think had won his appeal, or his appeal was pending or something. And anyway, he was able to come back to New Vrindavan. He was able to like move around freely. He was no longer under house arrest. We all looked at it at the time very naively as like a victory, like not knowing that actually like, you know, there was more to come and he would be eventually, you know, imprisoned for, you know, he would serve out a longer sentence. But at the time we were all just like, oh, great, like happy ending. He's, you know, he's back and he's like stronger than ever, that kind of thing. But I remember distinctly, both in New York and in New Vrindavan, that like going for like a darshan with him. And it was like a thing where he was really specific. I think it was, and I don't know Western classical music very well, but I remember it was like Bach. And there was another composer who wrote a piece called The Messiah, I think Handel. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. But those two, but Bach was definitely like his favorite. And I remember going for these darshans, and he would insist that Bach be playing, like while he does, like, I don't know if it was just like for the vibe or like he would, but and then I remember he would also, and devotees would, of course, you know, repeat everything that he would say, like, it would, you know, whatever he said became like a, you know, Bhaktipad says, and, you know, then becomes like almost like law. And it was like this thing that Bach was God realized, that Bach was God conscious. And that, you know, and it was, and so, and I think, and this is where it kind of got weird, especially considering that I was like from an Indian background and there were lots of devotees that were from an Indian background, but it was like, I think part of Kirtananda's theory or whatever, his, you know, this vision that he has is that like, Bach was God conscious, and because we're Westerners, or like maybe for like Westerners, like we can be moved by the God consciousness of Bach even more than like like traditional Indian music or something. Yeah. So again, I'm not sure exactly when it happened, but at a certain point that like kind of interest or obsession with Bach kind of became like slowly, or maybe not so slowly, replacing the whole like program of, you know, Bengali, Sanskrit, whatever, you know, Braj Bhasha, whatever languages, replacing them with English, replacing the instrumentation with American or Western instruments, organs. So the big one was a pipe organ. There was a pipe organ in the temple room, accordions. So there was a, not just one accordionist, if that's the word, but like, there was like, I don't even know what you call them, but like almost like a chorus, like a band
of accordions.
And they all had accordions. And like, I mean, it's not an easy instrument to play either. And like, so there were like accordion, like lessons being given, and they got quite good at it, and they would like compete, or they would like, you know, play in these concerts and compete in these like tournaments and stuff. And, but it was like a whole thing. And then choral singing, right? So that like kind of very typical Christian style of like, you know, choir music and choral music. That was like a thing, the Krishna choral singers. Dress, of course, that was like, you know,
women sannyasis too.
Women sannyasis. Women sannyasis. So I think women sannyasis may have been a little bit of a later touch, but like the dress, I think was a pretty early one.
Franciscan robes.
Franciscan style robes. And it was, the system was, the ashram was designated, like, you know how you can tell like who a sannyasi is, who a brahmachari is by the way they tie their dhoti, or right? I guess women are in saris and men are in dhoti, so that's one way of but like there was like a system, I don't know for how long, but I definitely remember being explained this, that the belt, you know, they had those rope belts. So the rope belts, like the color of it was like signaled, you're like sannyasis had a certain color, grahastas had a certain color. Wow. I think women had a different color, like, because, you know, from far, everyone just looked like these like hooded, and they had like hoods on them. I mean, they were kind of cool in a certain way, but you know,
Jedi kind of way.
Yeah, kind of like, very, very, very
Star Wars,
very Return of the Jedi, or you know, like Obi-Wan or whatever, or maybe I don't know, maybe they were Sith Lords. Now that we know what we know, it was more of the dark side.
Right.
But yeah, everyone had these like the robes, and again, it was what was explained to us, like the justification was very much like, oh, this is his like brilliant preaching strategy to like connect with Westerners, and you know, which is again, you know, something that I'm like a little wary of, because, well, in that case, it was also like, I don't know how much it can, maybe it did, but I don't know. If you're like a West Virginian guy and you're like, I don't know about these Krishnas. Right. Sorry, am I good?
That's good. Yeah.
If you're like a West Virginian guy, you know, with his family, and you're like, I don't know about these hairy Krishnas, but let me check them out. And you go and you're like, you see a bunch of people like in like hooded robes. Yeah. You know, I'm not sure that's like less weird to you. Like, I'm not sure like they're like, oh, all right, they're just like,
they're just like me and Jimmy.
They're just like me and Jimmy and the other Jedis. Like, I don't see how that like necessarily, you know, maybe if you're like coming from a Catholic background, you're like, okay, like, but then you're like, wait,
no, but still, even that.
Still, and then you're like, wait, but they're dressed like Franciscans, but they're definitely not Franciscans. And so it was just weird. But there was a lot of that stuff, and there was at a certain point, I mean, I'm trying to remember the first time I visited, because you know, each visit like
it got weirder.
It got weirder, and there's a thing about, right, like when you, it's like with a kid, like when like you can't tell how much your kid has grown so much because you see them every day. But like when I visit after I haven't visited your home like in like a month, and I'm like, oh my gosh, your daughter is like twice the size she was before. Like she looks like a whole different kid, right? So it's sort of like that, because my family, at my insistence, because I was so like in love with New Vrindavan, my family would keep visiting. And so like long weekends, like any excuse basically. I mean, we lived about an 8-hour drive away, 9-hour drive away. So it wasn't easy, but like holidays, long weekends, any excuse I could like kind of, you know, cook up. I would try to get my family to take me to New Vrindavan. So even in the months between, or sometimes a year between a visit, there would be changes, and all of a sudden I'd be like, oh, like we're doing this now. Like, wow, when did this happen? You know, there'd be like, I'm trying to remember, like, well, like at a certain point, I think maybe my first visit, there was still space to sit on the floor in the temple room. Definitely by like subsequent visits, the temple room was filled with chairs. And it was very like Christian style. There was like kind of an aisle down the middle. There were chairs. You sat in the chair for the service. I mean, I think we might have even used words like service. Wow. Everything was in English. So to your point, and I still remember those, you know, I mean, it's funny. It's like my memory is so bad. I feel terrible. Like I wish I had the kind of memory I have for like the actual like our actual like Bengali and Sanskrit bhajans, which I still need like a songbook. Like I'm like the guy that like by the end of Karthik, I will have Damodar Asukam memorized, and then next year I'll start all over again. I'll be like, I know it starts with Nama Mishram, but like I'm a little, there's like a couple of bimbas in there or something, but like which stanza has which, and like so I have a terrible, but like somehow I can still remember like we sang instead of I'm not going to sing the whole thing here, but like instead of for Gurvastakam, it was like the blazing fire of it began like the blazing. I can't get the tune right now, but it was like they try to keep the tunes kind of consistent.
They sang Nrsingadev prayers like that at the sanctuary.
All glories to Nrsingadev,
Prahlad finds
joy in you alone. Yeah. And then the one that I love, that I still love as its own thing. I don't like that it was used as a substitute, but it was the English version of Jai Radha Madhav.
Yeah, so beautiful.
Within Vrindavan's woods and groves. I think I have a copy of it, like a performance that was, I'll see if I can look it up for you.
Joy of spiritual love, all glories to this holy site.
Yeah.
So nice.
And yeah, it was quite a beautiful.
I connected
song
with it a lot actually at the sanctuary when they sang it in English. I was just like all about it.
I liked it. I don't like it as a replacement.
Yeah, not as a replacement. It evoked like more emotion from me because as a native English speaker, it's more understandable, and yeah, it just expressed better the prayer for me than the
interesting. Wow.
Because you have to put some more emphasis, you have to put more brain power if you have to first understand the language and then take that and then in real time, when you're singing it, you're expressing that. But when it's English, it's like already there.
It's already there. So you can just be like,
you
can just try to express the emotion.
Yeah.
That's so interesting.
Yeah.
This is making me think, maybe it's not, because I've always kind of been like, even with my own story, I've always been like, man, it was so weird that like I, as like a brown kid from New York, like actually like vibed with everything that was happening in New Vrindavan at that time. Like, I don't mean the illegal stuff, which I didn't know about, but all the cultural stuff, right?
Yeah.
And I always thought like, wow, that's just so weird. And I always just chalked it up to like, that like somehow I was so like, my eyes were smeared so much with the ointment of love for New Vrindavan that I like overlooked all the this stuff that was culturally so weird, which I think is true. But I think now I'm also thinking maybe there's another piece to this where like, because part of our story is like we're brown. We're like the perennial, what is it, Oreos or coconuts or something, where it's like, where like we present as brown, but like sometimes, especially when we're growing up, it's like you feel like really white on the inside, or you're accused of being really white on the inside. And like, we don't like pronounce, like we pronounce things in this like Americanized way that like our Indian relatives like make fun of us. And then we come to a place like ISKCON, or like in my case to New Vrindavan. And so even that, like when I like fall back, when I say the name of the place, I go New Vrindavan. Like I don't say like Brindavan or, like it's just so funny how like those things, anyway. But we come to places like that, and maybe on some weird subtle level, we're like, oh, like these people are like me. Like I think in English.
Yeah.
And like they're singing the song in English.
Yeah.
And I don't have to worry about like mispronouncing it or memorizing this like long, stotra in this other language. And like, I mean, part of maybe what I liked so much about New Vrindavan was now, I mean, I'm just thinking out loud here. I've never like fully processed this, so I have to think about it more deeply, but maybe on a certain level, New Vrindavan was like a kind of Hinduism or a kind of bhakti that felt accessible to me.
Right.
Because I was like an ABCD or an Oreo or a coconut or whatever. And I was like, hey, these people are like my people because like, they're like sort of like me. They're like into something that's like, ultimately connected to Indian roots, but they're doing it in this like accessible Americanized way. Right. And so I think there might've been something there.
Were there other Indian kids there at the time?
There were some. Some mutual friends of ours. I mean, they were very young because they're younger. They're I think even like younger than you, but like the Patels, like, I don't want to like out specific people and like name names. And they're going to like write to me like, what the hell, man? No one knew. I grew up in this freaking cult, but But like, there was a very beloved Gujarati family that lived there, and that I think, I don't know the years that they ran, but they like for a number of years ran the gift shop.
Oh, right. Okay, yeah.
And so, you know, we have some friends.
Yeah, of course.
So I would see them. Trying to think.
But they're way younger than you.
No, they're way younger. So this was already when I'm like, you know,
Right.
probably
But I mean, like when you were going there
When I
as
was
a
like
12-year-old or something.
there weren't really like brown kids that I can remember, or they were like mixed kids. There were like a good number of mixed kids, because I think by this point also Kirtananda was encouraging a lot of like mixed or like interracial marriages. He had, I think, a lot of, or he had some Eastern or Southeast Asian. I remember like there being like a
Sri
good number
Lankan
of
and stuff.
Sri Lankan, Malaysian.
Yes.
There was a good number of Malaysian devotees.
There was a lot of Malaysians living in the sanctuary.
Same. So yeah, I think some devotees from Thailand. I think it gets a little murky because like it's that whole region, but Malaysia for sure. There was like a good, like sort of solid Malaysian
I wonder
demographic.
where those guys are now.
I think they all kind of like went in different directions, but one of the to answer your question, actually, now that I think of it, the person who's probably most like foundational for me with those New Vrindavan visits, and really the person I credit with like kind of being I always forget what's the term for the my Vartman Pradikshina Guru.
Vartman Pradarshak.
Pradarshak, was it?
Yeah, Pradarshak.
Pradarshak. My Vardhma Pradarshak Guru is like this Indian American brahmacharini.
Oh.
Indian Canadian, I guess, but whatever, close enough, right? Like, so, but like me, born and raised, of Indian origin, born and raised in North America. You know, she was older. She was like in her, not that much. I mean, she was like in her early 20s, mid 20s. She was still pretty young, relatively speaking. But she became like my big sister, my sort of spiritual big sister. And really showed me a lot of care, a lot of attention, a lot of affection, a lot of patience. She explained stuff to me. We would pen pal each other because there was no internet in those days. There was no email. So we'd like handwritten letters.
Wow.
And so, every so often, maybe like every week or couple of weeks, I'd get a letter or a package from her. And packages would include like prasad, like so a lot of like mahaprasad, like sort of like maha sweets. Like she'd like, I still remember like these like bubble wrapped packages, and then there would be like you'd like unpeel the packaging, and there'd be like this like little maha sweet barfi or something. But she would send books. She would send lecture cassettes. So some of the earliest like lectures I've heard in Krishna consciousness, whether they were Prabhupada lectures, Kirtananda lectures of other devotees.
Yeah.
They were from those cassettes. That was like my, that was like my like sort of the start of my collection. First books I read in Krishna consciousness kind of came from her one way or the other. So, and I didn't think about it so much at the time, but now looking back on it, I think the fact that I could relate to her culturally was a big part of that. And it made New Vrindavan, I think, feel that much sort of safer for me. Like I was like, oh, if she can do it, then like I can do it. Because honestly, Nam, I mean, like at that time, maybe it was my youthful, I mean, it definitely was like sort of youthful idealism, but I was convinced, like being a devotee, once I decided I wanted to become, I wanted to be a devotee, I was convinced that the way to do it was you had to move to New Vrindavan.
Wow.
And move to New Vrindavan meant you had to be like full time. Like that's what you did. Like she was like full time. I mean, I remember even asking her once. I don't remember. I mean, there must have been a context. I hope I didn't just rudely like ask her like out of nowhere. But I remember asking her like, so like you're never gonna get married? And she said, and I remember this. She said. She said, I could be married, but I don't really want to do that. I want the lotus feet of my spiritual master to be my everything. And I just remember thinking like, that was like, it was like,
Oh my God.
when I heard that like phrase, or something. And maybe she might have even said, I just want to be married to the lotus feet of my spiritual master, which now I look back on it and I'm like, that's kind of like, there's all sorts of things like that are like a little weird about that. Like, but at the time I was so like blown away. I was so impressed. I was like that's who I want to be. I want to be the kind of person with that kind of faith who's just like, it was the only time I've ever really wanted to like be like a full-time monastic.
Right.
But it had less to do with being a monk and more to do with like, I just thought this is how you do Krishna consciousness, is you go and you stay in a place like New Vrindavan. And so for especially those early years when I was a kid, I was sort of mentally, secretly like thinking like, okay, like I knew enough to know like I'm a kid now. I can't like run away from home and go like show up and, you know, in Moundsville, West Virginia. They're just going to send me back home.
Yeah.
But I was like, okay, maybe when I just get like, I just have to like bide my time. And when I'm a little bit older and when I like get like of age or whatever, when I turn like 18 or whatever it is, like I'm going to just go to New Vrindavan. Like that's my future. Like I just sort of like, you know, decided that. And I think now that I think about it, it was a big part of it was that she was there. And I was like, if she could do it, then that means, right, I could, like, she's similar enough to me that I could see myself there.
Yeah.
And I don't think I realized that at the time, but I think looking back, that was probably what was happening. But in terms of the kids, not so many, not that I can remember. The community kids that I knew were pretty much, there were maybe there's a couple of there were a couple of black kids, but mainly all white or mixed race, like half white, half something else.
I guess we can conclude it now, but one thing I wanted to say was that we think that it got a lot of hits, but actually didn't. The Peacock documentary.
Oh, going back to, I was about to be like, what got a lot of hits? Like, how do you know how many hits like this podcast has gotten already? Like,
no. The Peacock documentary.
We don't.
The way I determine that is, someone told me that you look at trailers of other Peacock shows on YouTube, and if you look at the one, this could be changed now because this was like a few months ago. You look at the Hare Krishna one, and it was considerably less trailer views than all the other ones.
This is on YouTube.
Yeah, but you can determine how many people. It's like kind of it's like
a predictor
inference
of
prediction.
Okay.
Of that, if it didn't have that many views on YouTube, the trailer, then the actual documentary didn't have that many views.
Got it. Yeah.
But amongst devotees, I'm sure many people were like, "Oh, this is so cool," or "This is like scary," or whatever, and we should watch it and stuff. But I guess in conclusion, I would say devotees should watch it. I mean, I enjoyed it. I thought it was really good, well made. Disturbing,
Yeah.
but well made. And we held our breath while we watched it. And in the end of it, we let out our breath and said, this doesn't destroy ISKCON
Yeah.
in the end.
Yeah. And that's interesting because I mean, if
Let me
if
look
the
at the views
concern,
right now, actually, while you
You're gonna pull it up?
Yeah, I'm going to pull it up.
Yeah, I don't know. I think for me, it's the jury's still out, as they say, because I feel like
Really?
I like the documentary. I like the docuseries. And I think if your criteria is, does this destroy ISKCON? The answer is no. If your criteria is, does this seriously shake people's faith in Krishna consciousness? I think the answer is probably no. I think, you know, someone who watches a documentary and has a crisis of faith, there's probably other stuff going on. and maybe that, you know, not to say like, I like when people have crises of faith, but like maybe it was meant to be for them to like get stuff stirred up that they need to deal with.
Yeah. 43K views. Nothing.
So that's, I mean, this podcast alone will get more than that, right?
No.
That's pandering. I don't know. I don't know if your YouTube trailer to actual show predictor works.
Everything else is like 360K, 590K, 91K, 170K, Yeah, I mean, it's 13 million. Official trailer, Apples Never Fall, is some movie. 13 million views. Yeah, it's like, I don't know.
We should just do a podcast where you just like look at YouTube videos and just like announce in a voice of like derision how many like views. You're like 43K views. That's nothing.
Dude, on YouTube, that's nothing.
3.6 million views. Okay, that's something. Like, I know.
I'm sorry, you were making a point about something.
No, it's all right. But I agree with you. I guess I'm still kind of struggling with, like you come out on like devotees should watch this thing.
Yeah.
People in general should watch this thing. Or is that a different question? People in general should watch this. I'm not sure. I feel like, again, by the criteria of does it destroy faith? Does it make ISKCON look terrible? No, but I'm not sure. For me, because it's so much more personal, I feel like because of the New Vrindavan connection, it still feels a little bit like, I'm like, overall, I liked it. Do I like it enough to go tell people to watch it? My friend who just got their Peacock subscription. Do I want them to watch it, or do I want them to keep watching The Office? I probably want them to keep watching, episodes of The Office. I don't know. I think it's just still a little too personal.
Yeah.
I do have to say though that like I think for what it is, I think I agree with you that it's well done, it's well made on the whole. And they get a couple of things that are like get a little wonky as far as their like fact checking. If I have to say, if I have to like give a criticism of it, I would say I think for understandable reasons, it very much gives you this impression of like New Vrindavan and Kirtananda as being outliers, which is, I think, a good thing. But also, I think the reality is much more complicated, as we know. And I think, and maybe you can't do it in a docuseries, so I don't even know if this is a fair criticism, but it's like, if you didn't know the history of the zonal acharya sort of system, and you watch a documentary, you would think he's the only bad apple, and everything else was like hunky-dory in ISKCON from 1977
to totally.
And I think like, if you want a more realistic and accurate like view of history, you'd have to look at like what was going on in ISKCON from, I wouldn't even start in 77. I would start even earlier.
Yeah.
And then definitely 77 after Prabhupada leaves, when there's a zonal acharya system, what's going on in other places around the world that are similar to New Vrindavan, that are different from New Vrindavan. And I think that the docuseries just, again, maybe that wasn't their intention and they just really wanted to like narrowly focus and tell the story of one person and his impact on a community. But that's the one sort of critique that I would give of it. But on the whole, I liked it. And someone I did not expect to like as much as I did was Sergeant Tom Westfall.
If you're watching, please come on the podcast.
Sergeant Westfall, you're like kind of an unsung hero.
Yeah, he knew everything. He knew all about Krishna consciousness and stuff.
I knew a little bit about him from from having read things and whatever. It wasn't like his name was unfamiliar to me.
Yeah.
But in the context of the docuseries, to like see him and hear him kind of like tell it from his point of view, and also just how thoughtful he was about it. And you got the feeling, at least I got the feeling, I don't know if you did as well, Nam, that like at a certain point, he just really like cared for a lot of devotees.
Yeah.
Like
he did.
As an outsider, as a law, like a member of law enforcement, it's very easy for someone in that position to just be like, oh, these people are all crazy, and like I'm just like assigned to this beat, and I have to like deal with a bunch of these crazy all these crazy people. And he somehow manages to go so deep and in such a thoughtful and nuanced way that he's able to like see the good, the bad, and the ugly. And like, I mean, I think he really like became friends, if not like grew to really love so many of the devotees of New Vrindavan. And I think that comes across. So that was really
definitely came across.
That was really heartwarming to see.
Tulsi's texting me. We got to wrap up.
Okay, well that's
Thank
our
you.
alarm. Thank you. I didn't. You know, when we got this idea for the emergency podcast kind of thing, I thought we would just end up talking about the documentary. But
No, I mean, we got into all kinds of cool things.
and I'm grateful for that. I think for me, you know, one major takeaway here is I feel like New Vrindavan is a pretty significant part of who I am as a person, as a devotee, as a practitioner. Now, you know, even in terms of my family, bringing my family there.
We just went there like a few days ago.
Yeah. I feel like I want to not run away from that as much as maybe in subtle ways I had been, you know, given the history of it. And I want to sort of, you know, process a lot of that stuff and also just own a lot of what I loved about it and continue to love about it, while also being, you know, honest with myself about those aspects that are those like the darker parts of the history.
Totally. Thank you. Thanks everyone for listening.
Thanks so much.
Emergency Podcast. This is the Namras Podcast, the #1 Hare Krishna podcast. Please like, subscribe, and comment. I don't know if I'll keep the comments on for this one.
Yeah, maybe
I might turn the comments off.
Is there a way to, maybe let's talk about that. Maybe we just turn the comments off. Don't comment on this one. All right, Haribo.